Welcome to Great Chapters of the Bible. We continue our study of Psalm 139. This is a wonderful psalm in which David celebrates the attributes of God. He has described God's omniscience and his omnipresence. Now he turns to think of God's omnipotence. Being omniscient, God is all-knowing. Being omnipresent, God is everywhere present. Being omnipotent, he is all-powerful. Let's read from verse 13 to verse 16 of Psalm 139. For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvellous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret, and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. These 4 verses contain a tremendous amount of information and wonderful truth regarding the omnipotence of God. Just before we look at the verses, let me just say 1 or 2 things about this passage. First of all, it is interesting that when earthly potentates try to express or display their power, they tend to do things on a massive scale. And so they'll build massive monuments, perhaps great buildings or great statues, and by sheer scale they're trying to convey the idea of power and might. Well, David takes the opposite approach. Instead of looking at a macro expression of God's power, he looks at a micro expression, and he focuses on perhaps what is one of the most vulnerable and weakest things in creation, and that is the unborn child, the embryo, the fetus in the womb. And he sees this wonderful process of formation and creation as a display of the omnipotence of God. Secondly, it's interesting to notice that although David uses poetic language in this passage, he displays a tremendous knowledge of science. Scientists have been amazed as they look at this and study this. The language that David uses is scientific language. It is consistent with science. And so, of course, in the days before there were X-rays or scans, David, inspired by the Holy Spirit, is speaking with graphic detail and scientific accuracy about the formation of the human being in the womb. Thirdly, we understand from this passage that David believed that every time a human being is born, God is active in that process. It is not simply that God has set in motion a biological process that automatically takes over. God is actively involved in the formation of the child in the womb. That's an amazing thing. Finally, before we look at these verses, we live in a society today which has legalized abortion, which is nothing less than the murder of unborn children. And we must remember that this is a great sin, because every single human being that has been conceived and is being formed in the womb is the object of the active, omnipotent power of God. When we think of omnipotence, there are 4 things that come to mind. First of all, we think of energy or raw power. Secondly, we think of skill. You could have raw power, you could have energy, but not skill to harness that power. Thirdly, we think of design. We have power used in a skillful way according to design. And finally, we think of purpose. And so it's interesting to see that these 4 things are present in the passage we've read today. Firstly, there is power, raw energy. Secondly, there is skill. Thirdly, there is design. And fourthly, we're going to see there is purpose. Let's look at these verses together. In verse 13, we discover that raw energy and power is at work. David says, "Thou hast possessed my reins." Another version says, "Thou hast formed my inward parts. Thou hast covered me in my mother's womb." Again, this expression could be rendered, "Thou hast knit me together in my mother's womb." So David is thinking of 2 things here. He's thinking of, first of all, the creation of the matter, the formation of the inward parts. And then he's thinking of the blending and the in the knitting of these parts together. And so he talks about being knit together in his mother's womb. And so he's thinking of creation. He's thinking of the power of God in creating the inward parts of the human being. And secondly, these parts, of course, do not exist in isolation. They're brought together, they're knit together, formed into one unit, one body, amazingly unified, and yet the parts of the body are so diverse. And so David is thinking here of the energy, the power of God that could form and could knit together the human body. Let's go down now to verse 15. Leave verse 14, we'll come back to that at the end. But verse 15 says, "My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth." David is now talking not so much about raw power and energy, he's talking about skill. This word for substance in verse 15, it's actually the word for bone. And David is thinking of the skeletal structure. He's thinking of the skill that could construct the skeletal structure. And he uses an expression in the next phrase, curiously wrought. And this is very interesting because this expression is used a lot in the Bible, but I think on every other occasion it is used about embroidery work. It's skillful needlework. And so, for example, when we read about the high priest in the Old Testament, we have detailed descriptions of his garments. The Bible describes them as garments for glory and for beauty, and it talks about the curious work, the intricate, skillful work that went into the embroidery of these wonderful garments. Again, we read the expression when we come to the construction of the tabernacle, and we have the veil, and we have this needlework that was so intricate and skillful. And David uses this word, very interesting. And so he says that just as someone takes up the needle and thread, and with skill and with an intricate eye and with an attention to detail form something that is absolutely beautiful and stunning, that we stand back and we look at this tapestry or embroidery and we're astounded by it, David says that is exactly how God has moved in creating the human body. Not only has there been a display of energy and power, there has been an outstanding display of skill in the skeletal structure of the human body and in how the body is all woven together and embroidered together. It is a masterpiece of skill. Thirdly, we find in verse 16 that there is not only energy and skill, but there is in omnipotence design. And so he says, "Thine eyes did see my substance, being yet unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written." This is a different word for substance from verse 15. The verse 15 substance meant the skeletal structure, the bone. In this verse, it is the word for embryo. It is the word, a Hebrew word that implies wrapped together, a formless, shapeless mass. And David says to look at, there's nothing there, really, there's hardly anything there. But thine eyes did see. God could see what was the design in that embryo. And then he says, "And in thy book all my members were written." And here is the idea of a design to which God is working, a program that God has in the design and in the formation of the body. There is nothing haphazard about this. The interesting thing is, of course, that this points directly to one of the greatest scientific discoveries of our day, and that is the discovery of DNA. In our bodies there is written, as it were, encoded information and data that determines everything about us, that contains all the information that makes up who we are, that determines our shape and our size, our hair colour, our eye colour. It's all there in the DNA. And David, although he's not calling it DNA, that's really what he's saying here. He's saying there is a tremendous design, and everything is written, encoded, as it were. God is working not only with unlimited power, not only with astounding skill, but he is working to design. And then fourthly, at the end of verse 16, he says, which, talking about the members, he says, which in continuance were fashioned when as yet there was none of them. Some versions refer to this as the days that were formed for me, while as yet there was none of them. So in other words, David is saying that God expressed his power, his skill, his design with a view to days that were formed for David. In other words, a life that stretched out ahead of David. In other words, God is creating, God is using his power with a view to a purpose. David talks about days that are ahead. And so this is wonderful. In just a short passage, David has talked about the omnipotence of God, the fact that God is all-powerful, and as an example, he takes the unborn child, and he says, in this unborn child, we see energy, we see skill, we see design, and we see purpose. Now let's go back to verse 14. No wonder David breaks out. I think that he can't really wait to the end of the section. He breaks out halfway through and he says, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvellous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. David finds that he cannot refrain from praising God as he thinks of the intricacy, the wonder of the human body, the marvel of divine power, omnipotence that can create and form such a thing. And he says, I will praise thee, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. In other words, when I look at the human body, it inspires within me feelings of awe. That is the idea of being fearfully and wonderfully. It inspires me to think of the wonder, the skill, the wisdom behind it all. And he says, I trace it all back. It is sad today that our scientists will extol the virtues and the skill of DNA and put it down to blind chance and say that it was just how evolution happened. It was all just an accident. Whereas as Christians, we trace this display of divine power and wisdom back to God himself. And we can say like David, I will praise thee. May we be praising God today as we think of the wonder of omnipotence, his power displayed in the formation of the child in the womb. Thank you for watching.